Good evening. My name is Theodora Fischer, and I'm Chief Curator at the Fondation Beyeler. It is a great pleasure to us to welcome you to the museum this evening. We would like to thank the UBS, a long-standing partner of the Fondation Beyeler, and Mr. Oliver Zwemmer, Head of Wealth Management Basel at UBS. The Fondation Beyeler and UBS jointly launched the Artist Talks in 2017, and since then they have been held several times a year in various locations around the world, including here in Rien. Welcome, Otobong. I thought we could start with a question. My question, could you say a few words about who you are?
So where do I start? My name is Otobong Nkanga, and so I'm pronouncing it now the way everybody pronounces it, but the way my mother, my brother, my sister, my family would pronounce it will be Otobong Nkanga. So you don't really pronounce it that with the Nkanga, but it's softer. I was born in Nigeria, and I'm from the Ibibio people. So we come from the eastern, southeastern part of Nigeria. I studied in Paris at the Beaux-Arts in Paris, and later on at DasArts in Amsterdam, and then at the Rijksakademie, and yeah. And so since then, I've been making my work. I'm a visual artist, performer, work with sculpture, performances, installation, drawings. I think you'll discover it during the evening. And I'm happy to be here, and I'd like to thank UBS, and I'd like to thank the Beyeler Foundation for having me here and having this moment together.
Nevertheless, it would be interesting to know, how did you get into art, and are there sources of inspiration that were influential in getting who you are, what you are doing?
Yeah, I've always been drawing as a kid, making work, doing things, but I never thought of it as art. And I remember being at, my mother was posted to UNESCO in 1985. And we went to the British School in Paris, and my art teacher, Diana Shops, we would have art lessons and have all these books on Ingres, Giacometti to Caravaggio, very classic artists, and I was drawn by it. So I would spend my break time looking at artworks. We'll go to Musée Guimet, Musée Louvre, different museums in Paris, and I realized that it was something that when drawing, when making work or experimenting, it was the most calmest time in my in my life. And so it made sense, and that's something I wanted to do because it was the moment when everything was quiet and I could just focus on making things and also just enjoying and seeing other artists' works and wanting to be like them.
And so, following what you were just saying, how did you manage the balancing act between Africa, your homeland, and Europe, your adopted homeland, one could say?
Yeah, I think I was fortunate enough to be able to have a part of my adolescence in Paris, which was, a place where you could see so many things. And also going back to Nigeria after that and studying at the Obafemi Awolowo University. And there I studied art. But at the same time, one of the things that made it amazing was that I had a teacher that would make us do field work. So we would walk through the city of Ife, which is the crown or the kingdom of Yoruba culture, and that's the origin of Yoruba culture. And we would then be able to see all the things that were done by the Brazilian Yoruba people that would make pebbles in the street And you learn about other cultures just studying in Ife. And later on in my life, I went to Brazil, and I realized that many places, like in Ouro Preto, there were things that were I could actually see in Nigeria. So you kind of understand that we do not stand alone as a culture, but our culture has been influenced by also many other cultures coming in. We had the Spanish that came in much earlier, the Portuguese, and then later on the British, the French. You know, you have people, cultures passing through and leaving things behind and also taking things with them. So for me, it was interesting to understand how are we connected, especially with my Ibibio culture. How are we connected to other places? How come we're wearing balens and things like that for our traditional wear? And so it came with a lot of questions.
Good, good. Your work is based on a comprehensive concept, the core of which is the interest in, I'm quoting you, how things are connected, how we are connected to things, how are we working in the landscapes we live in, how are we managing to experiment with materials that we encounter every day. At the same time, your works, installations, performances, voice works, textile works, create many individual narratives, thus making the comprehensive concept and ideas vivid and understandable on a small scale. Let us talk about them, and by doing this, we will certainly touch on the big story. Which work will you choose to start with? I think it's that one.
Yeah, I thought I would, it's good that you've had time to look at it for a bit. And this is a work called Fattening Room. And I think this work opens up ways in which it talks about different cultures being put into one. But within the Ibibio culture, before you turn into, before you get married, the family that you're going to marry into would normally build a house, a little house where you would live in for about 3 to 6 months, depending on how wealthy the family you're marrying into is. So the more money they have, the longer you stay in this house. And this is the period where the woman is fattened. And she's fattened at the right places, the thighs, the bum, the hands, the stomach. And that also brings in the idea of fertility, that she's able to have a child. And so for me, that age, normally I should have gotten married. I decided that, well, I wasn't living in Paris. I will not do the fattening room. So I decided to make my own fattening room. And so that's why this work is called Fattening Room. But I did not think of it in the sense of getting physically fatter, but just thinking of ways in which the cultures that have come into our lives, how that has entered into my culture. And when we think of the Portuguese that came in at a certain time, and the Spanish, we also I started looking at paintings like of Las Meninas of Velázquez, and this is influenced from the painting of Las Meninas Velázquez. So I took myself almost like Las Meninas, and this is me in the sculpture made out of, the lower layer made out of earth and clay, in which I built every ring every month, almost like building my own house in which I sit in. And then the top part, which is made out of lace and taffeta, kind of entering into thinking of the meninas and the kind of richness and this material of textile that talks about rich, and also the color, the reflection that brings us into a place of thinking of rich materials, and combined both as a way of thinking of fattening. And this was a performance, at the same time a photographic work, at the same time sculpture. So it was the first time I was able to bring together many mediums into one, thinking of fashion, thinking of house, the yurt, thinking of sculpture and performance. And at the end of the day, the final work was the image cut into 18 parts and put together to make this photographic work. and the end becomes a photographic work instead of all the rest. So for me, the connection is not only about the material, the place, but also how materials, if we look at the lace and the earth, how that connects and creates a language. If we look at the history of architecture, how that connects in a place like Brazil or Nigeria, or in a place like in Europe. And so for me, I'm looking at these things that connect us and those things that resonate either in aesthetic, form, or concept, or texture, material, or
It's a very beautiful early work and a good example for what you were talking about. It's from 1999.
Yes.
So 25 years ago.
Oh my God. Time flies.
If we look at the work of yours, the process of its creation is always somehow visible. Indeed, it seems to be an essential part of the message or content of a work. The process of creation is therefore not just a means to an end, it is more, but what? It concerns, for one thing, the technique in which a work is made, like, for example, the weaving of the tapestries. And this is what we would like to hear now.
There are many ways of thinking of the work and also engaging in ways in which the thoughts, the imaginary, the aesthetic, all that come together. And with tapestry, I would start from my childhood and understanding what it is to work with yarns, to work with dyes, to work with other different kinds of materials, to understand what it means to put something in a chemical or not, or to work with the heat and tone. So for me, that idea of working with tapestries, and I've been working with that for quite a while now, since I think 2010, making tapestries, but I started much earlier with making batik. And my mother used to make batik, and it was the way of finding, thinking of it as an economy for the house, because she was a French teacher, but at the same time, when you're not paid by the government and they forget to pay your salary for a year, you have to find a way of taking care of your 4 children and putting them in school. And so my mother started by making art, making batik, making things like that. And that's when I learned a lot about color and learned a lot about batik, learned a lot about using caustic soda, all the salts, all those kinds of chemicals and minerals that come with that, or working with indigo and things like that. And so weaving became something very natural. And for example, with this tapestry, I showed this at the Kunsthaus Bregenz. And in Bregenz, it was a tapestry that, 4 tapestries in which we are able to see some of the tapestries here, which become one story. And the notion of weaving is so important in thinking about this, because as you put each thread together, you're creating new colors. So I worked with 12 yarns, and with 12 yarns, we're able to make 140 colors. So the more you're mixing the yarns, twisting, connecting, you're able to also create this other expansion and explosions of colors. But apart from that explosion, you're also able to create different kinds of bindings and different kinds of tension with the weaving. So for me, that was something I was very much interested in thinking about not only the weaving, but thinking about how my ideas that were linked to the bottom of the sea and bringing that to the surface, and thinking about climate comes into play.
Maybe I would like to add, also first, of
Yes.
course, I would like to add that these 4 tapestries are in the collection of the Fondation Beyeler. We are very happy about this. But no, what I think is important, you add that these are now digitally and,
Yes.
how do you say, made in Tilburg,
Yes.
in a culture, where weaving is also a tradition. So
Yes.
that's I think, also interesting to know.
Yeah, it is important because I looked at different places to be able to make the weaving. And for example, I visited also the Gobelins in Paris, but the Gobelins they make for the French government. But in the Gobelins, it takes a tapestry like this, and it's not even possible in the traditional sense of weaving to make a tapestry like this. It might take up to 12 years, 12, 13 years making one tapestry. So in the day and age we are in, it's a different kind of speed and different kind of time. And it's in Tilburg, you're able to work, there's a lab, and you're able to really experiment, push the technique further. And I remember when this was shown in Bregenz, and we had the machines that are made with the Donier machines, which are made in Lindau. Mr. Peter Donier came to see the tapestry, and he was like, "This is not made with my machine." And I'm like, "Yes, it is." Because he couldn't believe that you could actually push the technique that far with the kind of machinery, because you think it's meant to behave in a certain way, but you can actually tweak the machine to weave in another way, and to create also layers within the tapestry. And so for me, working at Tilburg is quite exciting because you're able to see also many designers, artists, architects thinking about structure, but also thinking about color and thinking about form. And you learn a lot from what other people are doing, but at the same time, you're able to build your own way of working. Yeah.
Well, we could talk hours about
Yes,
this work, so but we shouldn't. Maybe we come back to it, because another part of the process of creation are materials.
Yeah.
You are passionate, yeah.
Yes.
You are passionate about exploring the materials you are using in your works. They are sensual, palpable, often obviously connected to earth or nature. How did this interest in material come about?
Well, I think it's a build-up. I cannot say that there is a particular time that I felt like, oh, now I'm going to be working with material. But the thing was that I know from my childhood, living in Nigeria, you're so connected to specific things. Certain things are so obvious in the landscape, like encountering mica on the street when going to school. So you're walking on the street and you see this thing shining because the light falls on it, and you're looking at it and it's like, wow, and you pick it up on the street, and there are many of that running around. And these are phyllosilicates, so they're just mainly minerals on the floor, just there for you to play with. And this, of course, is in the 80s, where you have also the time of bling with Diana Ross, with everything that was blinging, and Bonnie M. And so for me, it was the moment of like, oh, something is shining. You put it on your skin and you imagine you're a superstar, or you imagine you're a singer. So that was part of my playground, just playing with materials on the street and imagining to be something or someone from America or someone from here. And so for me, it's just been a natural thing of being lucky to have been with materials and then growing up and encountering them in a different place. Like the mica, I encountered them in Morocco again, and I'm like, what is it doing here? And then it starts becoming a question that then becomes work. And that's the way I've been thinking about, if we think of architecture, the houses that we lived in the past, and now we're living in concrete houses which don't breathe, and then you have air condition. And then I'm like, why don't we build, or why didn't we develop a bit further earthen houses? And then I tried to see what has been going on in the world, who's making stuff. And then for Bregenz, I realized that Martin Rauch lives in Schlins, and I can actually work with Martin Rauch to make this work that then becomes this sculptural piece, and he knows a lot about rammed earth. And so you work with people that you know. So it's not only about the materials I know, but it's about my curiosity, and then working with people that have the knowledge, and then learning and sharing. and then able to then develop works and think further about the materials I'm interested in.
Maybe you have anamnesis now?
Yeah.
So sometime when you will come back to Fondation Beyeler, we will certainly show once you will install them properly.
Yes.
All four tapestries together with other things, the glass bowls, etc. Yeah.
So just showing you a few of the tapestries that have been shown at different places, the early works like this, Weight of Scars, which have photographic images on a plate on the tapestry, and then we get to anamnesis. Yeah.
Yeah, well, now it's a pity that we can only see it.
Yes.
And not be there, because you would smell it.
Yeah, you saw it in Bruges when I showed it in Bruges.
And I was mesmerized. Please, say something.
Yeah, so when we look at it, we just think maybe it's a wall with, a kind of dent or cavity in the wall. But this work is 11 meters long wall by about 5 meters high. And in it, we have this font, or this kind of cut within the wall, where we have elements that have been brought in by the sea into Europe. So it's to think about what are these elements that have influenced our food, the way we smell certain things, and how that has entered through the cross-culture and connections that we've had with Europe and many other places in the world. So what we have here are mainly like peppers. Like we could have peppers from Guinea, which were one of the early peppers that were brought in Bruges. You have coffee, you have cacao, you have red peppers, you have earth. That went too fast.
Go back.
I go back. And so with that, the sculpture is not only about the elements that have been brought in and put on the sculpture, but when you walk through the space and you can walk close to the wall, you're actually smelling the different elements. So the whole room is actually filled with scent. So for each space where the work is shown, we actually do a lot of research on finding out what comes into this area. Like in Bruges, we looked at the medieval times, what elements came in, and then we see there was tobacco, there were coffee, there were all these things that came in. And with these elements, then I used that to be able to sculpt this work along the wall. And you walk around the wall, it's almost like a belt, and you can smell the elements on the wall.
Although it is, when did you do it? Many years?
The first time I showed this work was in 2015 in Dijkterhalle in Hamburg. And when I showed it then, I only did one part of the wall. And later on, I showed it in Chicago, at the MCA in Chicago. And that's when I developed it as a belt around the wall. And so the wall is not just a wall, it becomes really a sculptural piece in the space. And people can walk around the wall and also smell the elements. So some parts are made quite low so that children can actually smell. So I'm thinking of the height of the human being, and thinking of ways in which we can bend, and also the performativity of the body in space, and also for young kids, taller people, and sometimes you have to lift someone up to smell higher, but to play with those different heights. So when you're looking at the sculpture and you're looking at the people looking at the sculpture, you start seeing a play, almost like a performance of bodies working with the sculpture, and that's what I'm interested in how that can play and can work with people moving through space.
And of course, it reminds us then also that where from all these goods are coming, and that they are still very precious to us.
Yes.
Coffee, chocolate, isn't there also
Yes.
chocolate?
There's chocolate, there's coffee,
Pepper.
there's cardamom, there are different spices, ginger, there's peat, there is tea, tobacco, there are quite a lot of elements in it.
Yeah.
And I think the name Anamnesis, why I wanted
That's
to call
the
it
title,
the title of the
Anamnesis.
work, was to be able to, because anamnesis means to recollect something that has been forgotten. And the work is really connecting to the memory and how smell can be a trigger to memory. And positive or negative memory, but at least it wakes up many thoughts and many, yeah.
Altogether, the place, your sense of sight is significant in your work. The place shapes the works and permeates them. Wherever you are, for example, your work in one way or another refers to the place. This was the case, for example, in Bruges, you mentioned it already, where you created a huge installation for the St. Jan's Hospital and as well as in other places. The location is certainly an inspiration, but there must be more. Why this big interest in letting the place have such a strong voice? Partly you already were talking about, but...
Yes. Yeah. For example, I'll start with Bruges, and this is an image of the exhibition that I did in Bruges in 2022. So when I was invited to this space, this is one of the oldest hospitals in Europe, so from the medieval times. And when I visited the space, of course, it's filled with so much history. But when you look also at the material that was built in, I don't know, 12 something, I can't remember the date precisely, you see that it's still standing today. And for me, it's very important to be able to understand that history, to understand what it means, what that space meant, and how that space has evolved, and also to see how do I connect with this space. And there was a work that I made called Taste of a Stone, and it made sense to be able to bring this work into the space because the whole building is held by stones. And so it made sense that I could bring Taste of a Stone with this base of the stone and thinking of the wood, and then create this kind of landscape in which you could walk through, and also think about that notion of bodies lying in space, what it meant as a place to open up for people that were moving through the country, what it meant as a hospital, which is a different notion than today what a hospital is, and to create a place that is calm, that almost like a landscape that you can walk through and see also other elements that belong to the collection and also the work. So there are different works that have come in spaces that make sense in relation to death, in relation to life. And the work, for example, this tapestry made sense in relation to the graveyards because the tapestry has plants that are commemorative to tombstones. And for example, this is another place in Sharjah, and I think about the context. And
Sharjah is where?
Sharjah in the Emirates, yeah. And so in the Emirates, with a lot of desalination, a lot of the wells are drying because of the groundwater is being used, and at the end of the day, the salt water comes in. Then it made sense to make a work. When I visited the site, I met this tree, and this tree was dead already. And I was like, why did you die? Meanwhile, there are other trees that are green around that area, and I'm wondering, why is this palm tree dead? So it made sense to make a work in which it died. I kind of created a fictive story about the tree dying from drinking salt water. and then it kind of brings in the history of the place and create this ponds with salt water. So you're slowly talking about the history of a place, you're talking about the possible future of a place, and at the same time, it's a place where you could move around, listen to sound, look at the work, and then it allows you to contemplate and allows you to think about the future. It allows you to think about materials. It allows you to think about ecology, the climate, and different things I'm interested in. But it's important to be able to find ways in which my ideas, my thoughts, my research, my finds a bed or a kind of ground in which we can both have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I should talk about this one too, because this one, this is
because it's so different.
It's so different. Yeah,
I think it's a good example.
Yeah, and when you talk about space and you talk about place, sometimes it's not only about being in a place and connecting to that place, but it's also about thinking about how certain geographies have shifted due to ecological, economical, and political policies and shifts. And for me, I'm interested in that because of coming from where I come from, but also living in Europe. You also understand and see, especially at the beginning of the economical crisis in 2007, that you see how that has changed the way, even in Europe, the economics of things, the way certain countries were branded. And so for me, the work that I did in Documenta was actually a soap. So when we look at the soap contains charcoal. And if we think of charcoal, it's something, it's an organic matter that has been burned in the absence of oxygen. And with that is connected with 7 oils and butters. So shea butter, coconut butter, all these things that are nourishing the world. And when you make a sculpture like this, you're putting 2 elements together, which is one that is burnt and the other one that nourishes. So they're in contradiction and they become the soap that you can use. But it also talks about geographies. So if we think of the palm trees, or let's say the olive trees that we have, in the next, I don't know, years and century, would we be able to still have those olive trees? Would we still be able to have those oils that we use? So for me, it's interesting to think about what the land offers, what a space offers is very particular. But once that space starts shifting, then what happens to that economy? What happens to that material? And how does it change also the power and the wealth of a place? So it was interesting to be able to talk about the burning of a place and also the nourishment of a place, but through a sculptural piece, which is a soap. And that still enters the notion of thinking of space, material, also skin care, and also economy. And with this project, we sold 15,000 soaps as a performance in Athens. And for 100 days, we had the performers performing, selling the soap. And with the money, we were able to open a foundation in Nigeria and an art space in Athens. And so like that, connecting different geographies and also thinking of what it means to be able to create a support structure that allows for things to continue. So for me, the notion of space, sculpture, material is quite an expanded one, not only about what I encounter in a space, but it's also about how do you think of creating something within a space that allows for other things to exist. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Good. Good. You have developed a very powerful aesthetic of attraction that draws us into a work. If we engage with one of your works only, we often get right in the middle of the whole narrative of youth. Why is this and how does it work? Because really, we are talking now, or Otobong is talking about the works, but if we are standing in front, you can see it here almost, you can feel it, but also the tapestries, or if we are looking at your performances. First is just the attraction to look at it without having to think about it at all. But then, because you are attracted and it looks beautiful very often, and maybe also familiar sometimes, or unfamiliar but interesting, and then you start about thinking, what does it say? But that's why I'm very interested to hear something about this.
Yeah, I sometimes we're looking at some things, and you could look at an insect, or you could look at a frog, or whatever, and they have these colors that are so attractive. Like the red is just incredibly red, or even some landscapes that have toxicity, intense toxicity, might have colors that are first attractive. So you might walk through a landscape, you're looking at the space, but actually it's been, you have the spill of uranium, or I've visited certain sites where there were former sites of mining, and they're glowing with colors. And so for me, it's kind of interesting to be able to look back at how nature and how the natural world uses also certain things as ways of attraction, ways of calling someone, like, oh my God, look at me, I'm this. But once you touch it, it might do something to you. It might be poisonous. It's like the red mushrooms with white dots on it. And then you're looking at it, and first of all, you might just think, oh my God, it looks great. But then if you eat it, it does something to your body. And so there are many ways of like entering into an artwork, or entering even when you look at a marble stone that is being created by time, and you're looking at it, and you could sit there for hours just looking at it. And I'm interested in those kinds of play between something that works with the visual, works with the eyes, and then the next moment it can then trigger something else that could work with the smell. And so you're using all those different possibilities, because that's what we humans, that's the capacity we have of having 5, or maybe we talk about 6 senses. And all those senses are ways of existing in the world. And some people can see, some cannot, some can smell better, some might not even be able to see color the way we're thinking. So we're having different abilities. And I'm interested in how the relationship of the body, those abilities, and how that connects also to how you enter an artwork, and how you could make things that might seem familiar, but then you could connect it with something that suddenly shapes the way we imagine that material to be. And I'm interested in those kinds of ways of working with the senses to be able to bring the body closer to the work, and then the brain works, and the body works, and the heart works.
So beauty is an ambivalent value then?
Well, beauty is a very difficult thing. I mean, a lot of us, there's certain things that we agree this is beautiful. But at the same time, it depends also from different cultures, many ways in which you've been brought up. And for some people, color is not at all a thing that is beautiful. Like looking at something that's so bright could be actually overwhelming. And for some people, white, a minimal color thing, or almost no color, is the most beautiful thing. So it's a very subjective thing to talk about beauty. But I think the way I would consider for myself, not necessarily about other people, is to think about ways in which tone, color, and atmosphere. So an atmosphere. Like in this room, we're here and we have the warmness outside, and in here it feels very cold somehow. And you have that warmth that is burning. It feels like something is burning out there. So how can I translate these two contrasts in the space and create the tone and the emotion of the space? And that is something that different artists will interpret it in many ways, but I think color, tone, and a kind of sense of an emotion to that tone is very crucial to be able to translate something. If someone finds that beautiful, then it's amazing. If not, then maybe they might find something else that they can enter in the work and connect to. Yeah.
You are open to talk about your work, but you never explain a specific work. Words do play a role, however, not in a discursive way, but in the form of poetry. We can see it in titles of works or titles of exhibitions and in short poems. You brought one here.
Yeah, I'm not good. I wouldn't say I'm not good at writing, but I do not enjoy writing. I love talking. I could talk for hours. Maybe you've noticed. But there are performances where, like one of the performances I did at Tate, which was, I think I talked for 9 hours nonstop. I just sat down, and the performance was about contained measures of shifting states. So people would come, and it's this round thing, and I would sit, and people would just talk. And we'll talk about things, about shifting states and about their lives. And 9 hours passed without me even realizing that 9 hours had passed. So language, I've always found that just writing like an academic text, let's say about my work, has been very difficult because it's, with language and with words, it's very hard to find sometimes the right word that can express everything you want to say. And for titles of works, for example, there was a work I did called Fragilologist Predicament, and I couldn't find a word that expresses the science of fragility. I looked everywhere. And I was like, so I had to invent the word fragilologist. It's like the person that studies fragility. And it made sense because you always say geologist, you always have terms for people that are studying something. And so at the end of the day, the title of the work was Fragilologist. And sometimes I have to invent a word that I feel makes sense for the title. But the only place that I feel that works very well and I could sit down in my room and just write for hours is poetry. So what you see here on this tapestry is a note from my sketchbook in which I'm writing the poetry of In a Place Yet Unknown. And so if we take a word like age or rage, then I start thinking of rage and I can think of sage. So both can actually become a performance where you're enraged, but you're using the sage to cleanse. So you can actually start playing with that kind of like, so you can have the smoke in the room and you can have the rage and you can be cleansing and raging away, but at the same time you can age from that because you've been raging too much and you've been saging too much. So in a way you're kind of like building up the story, and in my head it becomes like, whoa, and then as I'm aging, then it can become this fragile thing. But then, am I making people afraid? Am I making people angry? Oh, and then, so it started building up this place, or this poem of in a place in between a state, a solid, a melting, fragile. And so my thoughts are actually, so this is one of the most, less complex writing for the poem. But there are other ones that are more complex, where you have arrows and things. It's almost like drawing. And in this one, I wanted this tapestry. So this is a tapestry work. And at the bottom, you have liquid with dye and ink. And the tapestry is put in this liquid. And over time, the liquid goes into the tapestry. And the tapestry is falling apart at the bottom, but it's meant to slowly fall apart over time. And so the poem kind of disappears over time. So, but I was interested in this state of thinking about what fear does and how fear creeps into things, like almost like the liquid entering into the tapestry, and how that kind of changes the way we are without realizing that we're changing. And so I wanted it in a more physical way and as poetry. And there's some other poems like this that are pressed into earth. So this was the earth from the Vorarlberg region. And then the poem is actually pressed in it. And there's some other poems that are written normally in clay. There are other things. So I'm always writing in poetry because it allows to touch the most fundamental part of the work, which is the emotion. And by thinking or imagining or feeling certain things, it's hard to just say, I am angry today because this happened at 4 p.m., blah, blah, blah. But it would be maybe more interesting to talk about, not about how angry I am, but maybe talk about the stone hitting a rock, and then the rock hitting the sand, and then the sand creating gusts of terror, and then the terror becomes dust, entering into our lungs, mingling in, and then it then affects the rage or the anger or the happiness. And so you're not looking at just the anger, but you're looking at all the consequences that brings you to that state of being angry. And that emotion, maybe it's not anger, maybe it's fear, maybe it's terror, maybe it's uncertainty, maybe. So you start questioning, what are you thinking when you think, oh, I'm angry or I'm happy? What does it mean? And that allows you to break down and create a poem, which is not anymore about anger, but about all the steps in which you get to a state of being. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested if I'm angry or not. Who cares? Yeah.
Very beautiful, thank you. Also, only the titles sometimes are poetry.
But a lot of the titles are taken from the poetry. So some of the poetry will contain the title of the exhibition or the title of the work. There was a carpet I made, and that it was called Loaded Tears Turn to Rock. So if we think of our tears, they turn to salt. So it's a kind of rock. And then that's one work became Loaded Tears Turn to Rock. And then the other part, another work was Silent Caress. I have to remember it. But it became one poem, but it was two works at the end of the day. So, yeah.
Well, one question I have, but maybe you were already talking about, is what do you hope to achieve with your works? Maybe you don't have to.
No, but I think I can. I don't know if it's something what I need to achieve, but my own interest is, why do I put something in the world first? There's so many things in the world, and why should this work be in the world? And what should it be doing in the world? And there are many answers and many questions, that more answers and it brings more questions. But a lot of times it's to think about how would this work find its end life. Who am I making this work for? And I remember when I started working, and it keeps shifting, I remember that in many institutions, you didn't have many artists coming from the African continent showing, or you didn't have works that were part of collections that represented things that came from where I came from, unless they were put in ethnographic museums or put in a certain kind of box. And so for me, it was very important to be able to make works in which it can resonate for the younger generation, for other people that come from places that are not necessarily visible in different institutions that are here, especially in the West. And so that has shifted also over time. It's a constant shift of why you make work, but I think for me, it's resolving many questions that I have. And it's also that thing I talked about, it's a place of calm where everything shuts down. So the world, everything is happening in the world, and you have to find a place where you can connect deeply to the ground. You can be grounded. It allows for me to, to be able to understand the world in which I live in, and sharing my understanding, my own vision, my own understanding with other people, in which it would allow to open questions and ways of thinking about existence in the world. And I think that's already a big thing, because when you think of waking up in the morning, I have friends that, and people that waking up in the morning is such a big thing, or even having the desire to make, or the desire to exist. And you know that it's a very important thing to be able to make something that someone can look at, and it can be a mirror or a reflection of a possibility, a hope. So it's not only, and that's why the idea of connecting is so important, than the notion of thinking that we're so different, and that you're from here, I'm from here, and so because you're from here, I'm from here, we don't have anything in common. It's to create bridges. And for me, that is very important. I don't know if I make sense, but there are many, many reasons why. But these are just a few.
This is, this is directly what I would end with my last question. Your work is dealing with very serious, almost hopeless issues and topics. However, they always retain and convey a positive, life-affirming basic tone. I'm thinking on After We Are Gone, which will come afterwards, but you have brought with you another one, which is an example.
Yeah, this work is also a tapestry work I made in 2021. And this work is called Tied to the Other Side. And the way of thinking about this is not only thinking about how we are in this life, but also connecting this notion of how we return to dust, how we return to mineral, how we return again to nutrients in the soil. And that nutrient in the soil creates again another life. So if we think about the kinds of cycles that are in the world, is like nothing goes out, nothing comes in. We're just kind of like moving through time, and there's deep time, and things are melting away, changing form through heat, water, freezing, erosion, and then it settles somewhere else and becomes life for something else. So it's this kind of continuous circle of things. And I'm interested in the work kind of opening up, like you see the body at the bottom, at the same time, you have this new life that is starting off again. And we always take ourselves as the main center of the story, but like you talked about after we're gone in this piece, you have this plant, and this is the title of the work, After You're Gone, and actually there are other life forms that would live on beyond us. And so for me, it's interesting to be able to move away from a part of just a humanocentric kind of approach where everything is about me, myself, we human beings, everything is built for us. But meanwhile, you're having like the fungus, the bacteria, the virus, the plants. There are other life forms that are expanding, multiplying, creating their own kingdoms, living through toxicity, indulging in toxicity, and becoming something else, glowing in the toxicity. Meanwhile, we are fading in it. And so you're looking at where some things are evolving in such a fast rate. And if we think of Chernobyl, or we think of places of oil spills, or different mines that have spilled toxicity, you're also seeing life forms that are becoming new and other kinds of life forms that are able to survive within this. If we think of the abyss, we have down in the 3,000, 6,000 kilometers below the sea, you're having life forms that are able to live in such depth. So when you think of the kinds of expansions and life forms that are able to live, we realize that we humans are so fragile. And we are trying to compensate our fragility with our technologies and with many things that make us feel strong. And so for me, it's very much interesting to be able to think about these other life forms. And some of the titles kind of talk about the other side, or talk about after we're gone, or talk about other things that are beyond our own understanding and capacity. But when you look at, for example, this tapestry, you might just think of this plant, but this plant is a hybrid of many plants together in one. But it doesn't look like that, it looks like the same one. But it's a combination of many plants that have come together to withstand time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's the end. I, 'cause, 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 '